Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Ralph McGehee spent 25 years in the Central Intelligence Agency. He'll tell us tonight that U.S.-sponsored covert activity in Central America is both a danger to us and to the people we say we're trying to help there. Good evening. By most accounts, the American people are at the moment badly confused about this country's policy in Central America. Some recent polls have indicated, in fact, that most Americans don't even know which side our government is supporting in El Salvador and Nicaragua. U.S. policy in Central America undoubtedly contributes to some of that confusion. Officially, the Congress has prohibited covert aid for Nicaraguan Contras who are fighting the Nicaraguan government. And that's aid that's been used to wage a secret war in Central America. But also officially, the CIA and the Reagan administration has refused to discuss what aid has been or even perhaps is being offered to the Contras. The administration says the Sandinista government in Nicaragua is exporting revolution to other Central American countries with the help of Cuba and the Soviet Union. Yet in other minds, the evidence of that is at best circumstantial. Well, that's where our guest enters tonight. He has some definite ideas about just where U.S. policy in Central America is leading this country, and more specifically, what role the Central Intelligence Agency is playing there. For 25 years, Ralph McGehee served in the Central Intelligence Agency, duty in Japan, Thailand, the Philippines, and Vietnam. He also worked out of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, where he was a case officer on CIA covert operations. Mr. McGehee retired from the CIA in 1977. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Your central point, if I can attempt to state it, is what I remember to be the central point of the Church Committee's investigation, former senator from this state, that the CIA is essentially the president's covert arm, the vehicle that he uses to secretly engage in foreign policy.
Exactly. That's what I believe it to be. And I would go one step further and say that its intelligence, in almost every case, is used not to report the real situation, but to justify presidential policies. Even in such cases as Soviet nuclear weaponry, the intelligence is skewered to support presidential policies.
Why is it skewered?
Well, as the Church Committee, as we just mentioned, it is the covert arm of presidential policies. And as the covert arm, it must not only convince other policymakers, but it must convince the American people that those policies are correct. So it uses its intelligence as a means of shaping American public opinion as well as shaping the opinion of Congress and leaders of our government.
So it's designed by the president to reinforce his view of the way the world works.
Exactly. If not the way the world works, the way he wants it to work.
When we talk about covert activities, what do you mean by that?
Well, covert activities is sort of a generic term that, in the most broadest sense, means the overthrow or the support of other governments. Now, the overthrow actions can take the form of paramilitary operations, economic operations, political operations, or propaganda. Those are the basic forms of covert operations: the support of the media, support of politicians, and of course paramilitary operations such as you have now in Afghanistan, in Nicaragua, where you're trying through military force to overthrow a government.
What can you tell us? I mentioned at the beginning that I think maybe you would agree that most people in this country don't really have a very good understanding of what the United States is doing in Central America. Safe statement?
Very safe, yes. They do not.
What are we doing, as you see it, in Central America? What's the aim of the policy?
The aim of the policy is to impose on the Central Americans rules or governments that will pretty much accord to American wishes. Basically, we want friendly governments. And to achieve this, we have been traditionally, even since the Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt announced the Monroe Doctrine, excuse me, not Teddy Wilson, But the policy towards Latin America has been imposing U.S.-backed governments in that area who will allow the corporate wealth of the United States to exploit the countries there. Now, we have done this by supporting military dictatorships and the land-holding oligarchies in those areas. Now, these comprise a minority of some maybe 5 to 1% of the people, where we are suppressing the aspirations of the rest of the people, except for a small middle class. So basically our policy is to impose governments that will be responsive to American control. And to do this, we must, of course, via these governments, suppress the aspirations of the people.
Of course, the administration would say that the reason we are engaging in the policy we are is to prevent the spread of communism into this hemisphere.
Of course, this reasoning has been used traditionally from 1947 with the inception of the agency, with our operations in Europe and Eastern Europe, to Vietnam, to Southeast Asia, to the Middle East, wherever. We have used this excuse, no matter whether it applied or not. Some cases it did apply and some it doesn't.
Does it apply in Central America?
I don't think so. We have in Nicaragua, or there is in Nicaragua, a government with a 9-man ruling junta that is in the process of holding legitimate elections. The people down there are all, I have visited Nicaragua, spent a week down there, the people are all behind the government. They feel that the problems in Nicaragua are all caused by the Norteamericanos, as they call it, the trying to reimpose the Somoza-type regime over Nicaragua. We had Marines in Nicaragua, for about 20 years within this 50-year period. And
as late as the 1930s.
As late as the 1930s. And they trained a man, Somoza, who took over the government and ran it pretty much for the benefit of American corporations. And the Sandinistas was an effort to get rid of that very repressive, almost murderous rule that you had with Somoza. And now, it's interesting that the Kissinger Commission that went down into Central America and came up to evaluate what was going on, they said, well, our goal in Central America should be to create in that area universal literacy, universal health care, and land reform. Now, the only countries in that area that have achieved such is the Nicaraguan Sandinistas. They have, the first thing they did was worked on universal literacy, universal health care, and they redistributed land. Cuba, you had much of the same, and in Grenada, you had elements of that progress. And in those the countries that we back, El Salvador, the governments we back, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, you don't have that. You have military dictatorships that very brutally suppress their own people.
Well, you make the Sandinistas sound like a great bunch of guys, but they shut down newspapers and shut down radio stations and harass the Catholic Church, among other things, do they not?
They are allowing El Mercurio, the opposition newspaper, I believe the title is El Mercurio, to publish. There is some censorship. You might look at the, one of the reasons for overthrowing the government of Allende was that it was repressive towards the press. Well, what happened is as soon as the military dictatorship took over, they abolished all freedom of the press. Not only did they abolish freedom of the press, but people were kidnapped and there were tens of thousands of people murdered.
That was the Allende government in Chile, right?
That was the Allende government in Chile. When we overthrew that government and the military dictatorship of Pinochet took over, there was an immediate suppression of all freedom of the press. So we can claim that towards Nicaragua. There is a degree of censorship, of course. There is a degree of freedom of the press.
But the critical point in many people's minds would be, and the administration's view of this would be, what the Sandinistas are doing to foment revolution in neighboring countries, particularly in El Salvador.
Very good point. Not about a year ago, we have been justifying our policy against Nicaragua, the government there, by the support for the leftists in El Salvador that's flowing from Nicaragua to El Salvador. I think President Reagan describes it as a flood of arms that is going from Nicaragua to El Salvador. An analyst
And our covert operations there have been designed to stem the flow of those arms.
That's the ostensible reason. Of course, we really want to overthrow the government there. And we've built a massive surveillance capacity, aerial surveillance, marine surveillance, road surveillance. This analyst, David McMichaels, left the CIA, who worked on Central America, said there is no flow of arms. There isn't even a trickle. There haven't been any arms that have gone from Nicaragua to El Salvador since 1981. At that time, it was a small trickle. Now, most recently,
well, the administration might counter that and say that our policies worked. We've cut off the arms flow.
But they're saying there is a flood of arms when the same framework, the same time frame. They're saying there was a flood of arms.
I see your point. Okay.
Now, most recently, John Horton, the National Intelligence Officer for Latin America, the highest level within the CIA, for preparing national intelligence estimates on what's going on there, resigned in protest. He said Casey and Reagan were forcing him to make assessments that were inaccurate, that were just forced assessments to justify our policy. Now, this is a gentleman who's been with the agency for over 30 years, who has held some of the highest positions in the CIA, and a loyal agency supporter. He has resigned in protest, and he is afraid that the excesses of Reagan and Casey are going to cause a situation similar.
Casey being William Casey,
the director of the CIA.
Okay.
Similar to the era you had prior to the mid-'70s, when the agency was operating very much illegally within the United States and around the world was involved in all sorts of schemes and getting us involved in Vietnam, for instance.
So the larger point, as the CIA relates to Central America, relates to the CIA, is that the danger there is badly overstated, if not just completely overstated by this administration. That's your point.
It's almost totally fabricated, I might say, rather than overstated, fabricated.
Well, again, I'm forced to ask you the motive, what you see as the motivation for doing that. What possible motivation could there be for creating this, perpetrating this great hoax?
We have to convince the American people. In any effort that the CIA undertakes to overthrow a government, is currently trying to overthrow 10 different governments, you have to justify to the American people that activity. So you propagandize the American people, and we've seen a softening of American opinion towards operations in Nicaragua. So you propagate to the American people there is a flow of arms, that this is not the poor people of Nicaragua rising up and having their own government, but it is the international communist conspiracy, if you will, the Soviet-Cuban connection that's trying to get themselves into Nicaragua and control that country. By that means you inflame the public opinion, American public opinion, to get them to back American policies toward Nicaragua. And I assume shortly after the election there's going to be a military invasion of Nicaragua. And my assumptions are certainly mirrored in what the Nicaraguan leadership is saying and preparing for.
American troops?
American troops.
So this, fundamentally, as you view it, is Ronald Reagan's anti-communism run wild.
Yes, yes, anti-communism and serving the needs of the American corporations.
How does this hurt? I said at the beginning that you would make the case that this hurts the United States as much as it hurts the people that we profess to help. How does it hurt the United States?
Well, we all believe that we are a moral government. We're out doing the best we can for the peoples of the world. Well, we saw what happened to our people who served in Vietnam. Going there with these ideals, we're going there to save the people in Vietnam. And we had the same situation in Vietnam. We were lying to the people. And the traumas that the American veterans suffered while serving in Vietnam and when they returned home. Another area where I feel we're in serious danger is the loss of our own liberties here at home, the gradual erosion of our own liberties here at home in the name of protecting national security. I might mention when I tried to write my book, I had to clear it through the CIA, and it took 2 years. And at one point they said, we're not going to let you write this book, even though I wasn't violating any strictures.
Your book is called Deadly Deceits, My 25 Years in the CIA, published last year.
Yes. But that was, I think, one small example. It took me 2 years to fight that through the agency. Now, President Reagan and National Security Directive 84 tried to make the same secrecy laws that I operate under apply to close to 4 million government employees, and contract employees of the government and government employees, so that anything that they wrote or said for the rest of their lives would have to be cleared through their parent agency. Now that's what pertains to myself. Because I signed the CIA secrecy agreement, I must clear through the CIA everything that I say and write. And President Reagan tried to apply that to all government officials at any significant level. Congress would not go along with this. However, in the interim, 250,000 executives, government executives, have signed secrecy agreements, and now they are subject to that same restriction. Before they can write anything, letters to the editor, op-ed pieces, or make speeches, they must submit to their parent agency for clearance their material. That is one area where we are losing our freedoms. And the ability to...
Well, the purpose of that, though, it seems to me, is to protect legitimate national security interests that you, as 25 years in the CIA, might have had access to, that would be detrimental to the country.
Well, that's the claim, of course. We need to protect national security. Well, I wrote my book with the intention of not revealing any secrets, just criticizing what was going on. And I drew from the Church Committee report, I drew from the Pentagon Papers, I drew from the Pike Committee report, I drew from House and Senate Intelligence Committee reports about the CIA for the material to document my criticisms. I did not, in my estimation, include any secrets, but the agency would not allow me to say these things, even though they were in the public domain and had been officially released. That stricture was used merely as a means of preventing my criticisms of the CIA, and that's how any bureaucracy will use that sort of regulation. You have the loss there of the ability to speak out from those most capable of criticizing the government, those who have served at significant levels within the government, who are restrained because of this. I said it took me 2 years to clear my book. Not many people are going to endure that sort of thing.
Let me just return for a moment to this question of Cuban and Soviet involvement in Central America. Would you have us believe that the President, and not only the President, but lots of other responsible, presumably responsible political figures in this country, in a bipartisan way, not just Republicans, but Democrats, people of all shades of political opinion, really believe and firmly are afraid that there is Soviet design, a pass through the Cubans, if you will, in Central America? Are we not to believe that the Soviet Union wants to have some lever in Central America, and if they can use the Nicaraguans, won't they?
They certainly want to have some lever, but they're not about to challenge the Americans in their own backyard. The Nicaraguans, the support of the Nicaraguans, coming to the Nicaraguans, they are getting support in the form of weapons to the Nicaraguan government, but that does not allow them a foothold, as you will, within the Central American continent. We could, if we had adjusted our policy at the earliest phases, and even now we could do it, to accept the leadership of the Sandinistas over the country. We could have developed relations with them, and it would have been basically a friendly country today. But we have, because of our efforts via the Contras that are invading Nicaragua every day and killing Nicaraguans, we have forced them more and more into the Soviet sphere. Now the Nicaraguans realize that if the Americans invade their country, the Soviets aren't going to help them. The Soviets have virtually announced it. The Fidel Castro has announced it, you know, all my good wishes to you, but if you're invaded by American troops, we can't do anything for you. It's not that threat, the threat that exists in Nicaragua, that Nicaragua presents, is it is a movement of the people, basically, to take control of their own lives. It's not a puppet government of the United States.
Many people, Mr. McGehee, see analogies between Central America today and Vietnam in the 60s. Do you see
Very strong analogies.
In what way?
The deceptions that are being used to convince the American people to support, get behind presidential policies. There was a whole series of deceptions used to generate public support for the Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, a generated incident where an American warship was hit by one bullet, I believe. This opened the floodgates. President Johnson went to Congress, got a congressional resolution of support, and the American troops went in. Now, in 1965, there still was not real consensus among the American people to support the war there. So we had to justify. Now, we were claiming it's a war in Vietnam, and these are all parallels that fit with Central America, because the same things are going on in Central America today. We wanted to justify the introduction of American troops. So the agency loaded up, and the theme that we were using was that the war in Vietnam was an invasion of the legitimate government of South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese. But we had no North Vietnamese troops that we were capturing in South Vietnam. We had no North Vietnamese arms that we were capturing in South Vietnam. So we had to do something. So the agency loaded up a Vietnamese junk with communist weapons, and it has warehouses of weapons around the world, communist weapons. It floated it up the shore of South Vietnam. It shot it up, and it brought it in the American media, and the International Control Commission said, here's proof that this is an invasion.
Staged an incident.
It staged an incident. Then the State Department wrote a white paper saying the threat to the peace, North Vietnamese attempts to conquer South Vietnam. And almost all the only evidence they had, except for I think they had 6 regroupees from North Vietnam to the south who had been arrested, captured. Except for these 6 people, all the evidence was based on this weapon shipment, this staged weapon shipment.
While not denying the connections that you and others see between Vietnam and Central America today, some would carry the analogy farther and say you only need, if the purported reason we went into Vietnam in the way we did was to protect the South Vietnamese from being overrun by the North Vietnamese communists. You need only talk to the Vietnamese boat people to know that there were horrible atrocities committed in South Vietnam after we pulled out.
No, there were not. People were sent to re-education camps, but the majority of the people were supporting the National Liberation Front. And this is where
the Viet Cong.
The Viet Cong. This is where I began my descent against the agency. Up until this point, I was a loyal agency officer who would tolerate no criticism of the CIA. By the way, upon leaving the agency, I was awarded the Career Intelligence Medal. I have a commendation from the director for developing a counterinsurgency program used in Thailand.
Well, how do we explain the Vietnamese involvement today in Cambodia, then? I mean, that's not the kind of a regime that we'd want living next door to.
But who are we supporting? We are supporting, as another agency covert operation, we are supporting Pol Pot, who's living in Thailand. His troops are living on the border of Cambodia. Pol Pot, the most murderous regime possibly in the history of the world, who killed almost 25% of his people. We are supporting that group to overthrow the Vietnamese-backed government in Cambodia now.
I want to ask you about a couple of other things that are in the headlines right now. 3 times in the last year and a half we've had these truck bombs in Beirut that have taken American lives. There has been great criticism following this most recent event of our general intelligence capability, something that most Americans think the CIA should be doing a good job at. Why does it seem that we always don't know what's going on in these situations? We don't even know who perpetrated these outrages on 3 different occasions.
It's my conclusion, and I think it's so documentable that it's just so obvious. It is not an intelligence agency, despite all the hoopla that goes in propagating it as a intelligence agency. The Pike Committee report, the House Intelligence Committee,
Right.
Pike, took 8 situations and evaluated the agency's intelligence. And it was completely wrong or non-existent, its intelligence. Now, it's my contention, and I lived through the process, that it's deliberately structured to be a good covert operations agency. But because it's structured and it puts all its money, emphasis, manpower on covert operations, and therefore its intelligence is relegated not only to a secondary role, but to a supporting role. So you don't have built-in.
So that explains why we don't know who
We don't have any intelligence. We got a lot of good covert operators out there, burning and banging and snooping and pooping, as the term is, but who don't have the slightest idea of how to gather and evaluate intelligence.
The famous libel case involving General Westmoreland and CBS over their documentary on Vietnam is scheduled to go to trial soon. The central issue is that Westmoreland essentially participated in an effort to rather systematically underestimate the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troop strength, a deception that went all the way to the president, according to the documentary. Do you buy that?
Oh,
Do you buy the case that CBS made?
I buy the case, except the guilt is spread too thin. The CIA, beginning in 1954, was involved in Vietnam, and from 54 until 1975, lied about the nature of the war, even to itself. There's a mass-based revolutionary movement supporting the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong even announced over their radios that they had 7 million people in their various liberation associations, South Vietnamese in South Vietnam. And yet, in the agency's intelligence from 54 to 75, and I've gone through the Pentagon Papers and I worked in that area, so I've covered the whole spectrum of the war within my own personal experience. There is not one mention of one Liberation Association member. They completely wiped that out of their estimates. The mass-based nature of the revolutionary movement in South Vietnam was supporting the Viet Cong. The same thing you have now in El Salvador. We talked...
Let me just interrupt. I just have 30 seconds. In all due respect, it seems to me that, in a way, some people are going to see your indictments as casting light on the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. government, frankly, the same kind of light that we cast on the Soviet KGB and the Soviet Union. Are you saying, in essence, that there's not much difference?
I'm saying, in essence, that the agency's purpose is to support presidential policy, and deceit of the American people is a prime part of its responsibility.
Okay, the book is called Deadly Deceits, My 25 Years in the CIA. Ralph McGehee, we thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate your chat. That's our time for tonight. I'm Mark Johnson. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.